Up ahead, the fighting was bitter. The wounded were brought down to the beach and given first aid by the medics. Then they were loaded into whatever craft was available. The difficulties of loading sometimes made for rough handling, but the men engaged in the work were as gentle as possible under the circumstances. And the circumstances were never very good. Sometimes men had to be carried out to boats 50 yards offshore. When the small boats got back to their motherships, the wounded were lifted to the deck in slings. This new type sling could lift 2 stretchers at a time. The wounded, of course, were carefully strapped in. While there were some hospital ships available, in many cases the same ships which had carried the men and supplies to Saipan now became mercy ships to care for the wounded. On other ships, the LCMs, which had been suspended over the holds, were lowered into the water. Now the M4 tanks were raised from the hold by the powerful booms and lowered carefully into the waiting boats. This was a delicate operation. One slip and 33 tons of steel would go crashing through the fragile bottom. Once in the boats, the tanks were taken up to the line of departure. Here they lay. A coral reef blocked all but the smallest craft, and it wasn't until the engineers blasted a passage that the LCMs could go in. As more and more fighting men got ashore and began moving inland, the difficulties of supplying them increased. It wasn't simply a matter of getting the supplies into the beach. The right supplies had to go to the right troops at the right time. The LCMs and LCVPs were constantly on the move from ship to shore and back again. As soon as the beachheads were secure and the roads cleared, trucks and jeeps were brought in to handle the growing transportation problem. But not all the supplies reached land safely. The Japs threw in everything they had. Fire and hung up on the reef. In fact, this coral reef, some 400 yards offshore, was a constant headache. In some cases, ships were forced to pull up to it and drop their supplies overboard so they could be floated ashore through the shallow water. But some things wouldn't float. There was an answer for that, too. One LST carrying 155mm guns pulled up to the coral reef and dropped pontons which it carried on its sides. The pontons were towed around to the front of the ship and used to bridge the reef. Then the 155s were towed down the ramp by their prime movers and across the pontons to shallow water. From here, they could make the shore without any further trouble. And the ammunition was not far behind. The ducks came up onto the pontons and moved into the LST. Inside, they picked up a load of 155mm ammunition, then came back over the pontons and carried their load directly to the gun positions on shore. A concrete pier at the sugar refinery was used for unloading some supplies in the early stages. But after it changed hands a couple of times, it was too badly battered to be of any further use. Later, a pier was constructed by the engineers out of pontons carried to the spot on the sides of LSTs. Now, the LCTs and barges with outboard kickers could be used even at low tide. They could be brought up to the end of the pier, which stretched beyond the reef, and the heavy equipment they carried could roll off the other end onto the beach. The methods of handling smaller supplies changed often. In the early stages, the landing craft were loaded by stacking the supplies neatly in piles. But this took too much time, and time at this stage of the game was precious. Before long, the supplies were being dumped into the boats, helter-skelter. However, this kind of load took too much time in the unloading at the beach. The problem was finally solved by dropping a net full of supplies into a boat intact, then bringing the boat up to the end of the pier, where a portable crane reached in, picked up the net, and dropped it directly into a truck. The truck made its way back to the beach and set off along the road to its unit. Perhaps the worst problem in using the native roads was the dust. When the coral was pulverized by trucks and tracked vehicles, it became a powdery white dust which blanketed the area and made the movement of supplies a slow and hazardous business. To combat the dust, the roads at first were wetted down with water, which worked fine for about 5 minutes. Later, American ingenuity went to work and produced this Rube Goldberg contraption to cope with the problem. Captured oil drums were suspended from a crane and punctured so the oil would spray out onto the powdery coral. The oil did a much better job of laying the dust than any amount of water. But even with the roads in good condition, transportation continued to be a problem. There was never enough. The troops used everything they could get their hands on, including ox carts. Perhaps the most useful addition was this narrow-gauge railroad. There were 55 miles of track on Saipan, extending all the way around the island. But the 6-mile stretch from the pier to Aslito Airfield was the most important, at least in the beginning. Of course, the track had been pretty badly torn up by our own bombs and shells. But the Army engineers and the Navy Seabees went to work a few days after we hit the island. They ripped out the torn track and leveled the roadbed. They replaced shattered ties. Once the track was in shape, the same outfits went to work on the rolling stock. The locomotives had been pretty badly shot up by our planes in the early stages of the invasion. Some of them looked like a used target on a rifle range. Getting them in shape to work again took a bit of doing. There were no new boilers, so the old ones had to be patched. And the dinky little flat cars were scattered all over the landscape. But a little sweat and muscle and a portable crane got them righted and back onto the rails. Then they were pushed back to the yards at the sugar refinery, where they were hooked together to make up a train. Now the best of the locomotives was groomed for its maiden trip under GI auspices. Its boiler was given a long, cool drink. Its tender was piled high with firewood, crates, broken ammunition boxes, driftwood, anything that would burn. A fire was built in its belly. When it finally managed to get up a head of steam, it was backed into the yards and hooked onto the string of flat cars.